We're going to start talking about verbs. Now, we've already learned a simple way of making sentences or of using predication, that is, putting together subjects and predicates in Hebrew. Namely, we do it without verbs, right, with just linking together nouns. Now, by far the dominant pattern in Hebrew, of course, is to use verb forms. And what the good news is and I should say there really are verb forms. Okay, you can't just pretend that this wasn't going to happen. And they're conjugated. That is to say, we have persons, numbers, and genders to worry about. But the good news is that there are really only two, count them, two major tenses. Okay? Unlike Greek, where you had perfect and imperfect and aorist and or present and imperfect and future, you got two in Hebrew. All right. Generally speaking, these are categorized as follows, and this is an oversimplification. Remember that whenever we talk about things that sound easy in a language, they turn out to be hard. And when you run into stuff that sounds hard, it turns out to be good and helpful, right? Example, case endings, right? In English, we've learned to live without them. We have a few left in our language, like who, whom, but by and large, we don't have case endings. But that means that it's harder to find out which words go where when you're diagramming a sentence and sorting out the parts. So you get to Greek and you learn all these cases, and then you find out that it's real easy, even though you got to figure it out, to know what the subject and the predicate and the indirect object is just by looking at the case endings. So also with verbs. Greek has a much more sophisticated system of verbs than Hebrew does. This sounds good at the beginning, but what it means is that you've got a lot of the same nuances going on. It's just that they're not marked as clearly and obviously. So that the weight of what a perfect or an imperfect tense has to carry is significantly more, and that can make translation a lot more difficult in the long run. Even at this stage of the game, it sounds a lot better because you only have to learn essentially two sets of forms. But since we're at that stage, let's rejoice in it. Now, even these names, perfect and imperfect, are somewhat misleading. If you look at the beginning of chapter 4 at this chart in the textbook, you'll see that I don't even call these tenses, I call them aspects. Many grammars talk about these two tenses simply in terms of their morphology, the forms that they have, and the perfect tense, as we're going to see, that's what we're going to tackle first, is called the afformative verb forms. That's a big fancy technical term for they have stuff added to the back end. I put suffixed in parentheses or in quotes here because these really aren't suffixes. They're parts of the verb that are part of the verb form, but they look like suffixes. In other words, how are we going to form the perfect? We're going to take a root and we're going to add stuff to the end. That's where we're going. This is not unlike luo, lues, lue. You take a root and you add endings in Greek. Finally, you'll see that the tense is also in quotes because this is a terrible overgeneralization. But for the sake of getting started, and you can read some of the fine print here that tries to explain that it's not quite, it never is quite as simple as it seems. For the sake of getting started, we're simply going to make these two very broad, general overgeneralizations. That the perfect tense is, for all practical purposes, a past tense. And the imperfect is, for all practical purposes, a future tense. Now be careful here coming out of a Greek course where you're taught that the imperfect is another type of past tense, okay? And that takes a little bit of toggle switching in your head to get these things sorted out. But for all practical purposes, again, oversimplification, imperfect is future. Some grammarians would characterize the difference as completed action, and imperfect is incomplete or action, which would imply stuff that still has a future dimension to it. That's another way of trying to explain this that, again, is probably mostly right, but not completely right. But let's not worry about those fine points now. Let's get going, and when we get into texts, then we can start sorting out some of these differences. I've also told you that the perfect tense is going to be formed by endings or suffixes of some kind. Endings or suffixes. We'll see this later. We're not going to worry about it now, but the imperfect or future tense is characterized by prefixes or stuff at the beginning of the word, all right? Which is kind of nice. It's sort of a handy, again, oversimplified but handy way of getting at the essential differences here. Okay, second topic by way of introduction. Verbs are built off a verbal root. Now, this is one of the hardest and most confusing parts of the language, especially for learning verb vocab. I'll come back to that topic in a minute. But it is also one of the most distinctive features of Hebrew and other Semitic languages that helps in vocabulary building. Consider the fact we've had a noun, haven't we? Can you read this? We've had a noun, Evid, right? Have we had this word? Mm-hmm. Have we had a noun, avodah? Yeah. All right? Well, good. If I could spell it, it'd be even better. Avodah. What does Evid mean? Servant. What does avodah mean? Service. Servitude. All right? There is a verbal root, a verb form, that lies behind both of these words. Could you guess what it is? It's the letters ayin, beith, daleth. That's a verbal root. Anybody want to guess what the basic meaning of this verb is? Serve. To serve. All right? We'll put it in an infinitive form because that's the way we like to talk about verbal roots in English. Okay? But these three root letters carry with them the basic meaning of serve. Now, do you see what's helpful about this in vocabulary building? Very often, you're right here, you're getting essentially three words for the price of one. If you understand the verbal root